Hi, Roberto. I am
Hi,
happy.
nice to see you here.
Thank you very much indeed.
Juliana, I think you can start.
All right, thanks, Roberto. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our online course and workshop for a Manifesto for the Just City, organized by TU Delft in collaboration with several universities around the world, the UN Habitat World Urban Campaign to commemorate Urban October, and the Pakhuis de Zwijger, a cultural platform in Amsterdam that hosts activities connected to the topics of cities for all. We are extremely glad to have you here today and happy that many of you also have decided to participate in our call for a Manifesto for the Just City. We want to remind you that this event is being recorded for the podcast The Duty of Care, a podcast on issues of the Just City produced by Roberto, Rocco, and Hugo Lopez. There are already 14 episodes available at the link made available in the chat. My name is Juliana Gonçalves. I am an assistant professor at the Department of Urbanism at TU Delft. This is the first year that I'm joining this event, and I want to thank Roberto and Caroline for inviting me to be part of this initiative. To me, the exercise of writing a manifesto for the Just City is significant for at least two reasons. First, because of the deepening inequalities and segregations in cities really calls for social justice in the city. I believe that we really need alternative visions of what a just city looks like. We need alternative visions that actually accommodate different ways of living in the city. And these ways of living in the city should not clash with other ways of living outside the city. Second, because a manifesto, I think, is a wonderful way to describe these alternative visions. In the dictionary, a manifesto is defined as a written statement of the intentions, motives, and views of an individual or a group. And I believe the exercise of writing down our intentions and views on paper gives us a sense of concreteness, reinforcing our commitments to our ideas. However, despite the concreteness of written words, I also believe that both manifestos and the visions that they describe should be open for reflection and revision. And this is a little bit my manifesto for a manifesto. We are a team at TU Delft Center for the Just City and the Global Urban Lab, the TU Delft platform to discuss issues of urbanization in the Global South. We are also supported by the Delft Global Initiative and the Spatial Justice Network. You can find these links in the chat as well. Last week, we had Professor Gina Milan Brightside from the Universidad del Valle in Cali, Colombia, speaking about insurgent planning in Colombia. Her lecture is available on our YouTube channel, which you can also find the link on the chat. But today we are here because we have a very special guest for this final session in our event. Our special guest is Professor Vanesa Castan Broto from the University of Sheffield in the UK. Vanesa is a world authority on the governance of global environmental change in the urbanization age. Her previous books include An Urban Politics of Climate Change and the edited collection Participatory Planning for Climate Compatible Development in Maputo. These links will also be available in the chat. Both books are really amazing and unmissable. She was also a contributing author to the UN's Habitat 2016 World Cities Report. In 2016, she received the Philip Leverhulme Prize for contributions to geography. And in 2013, she also received the United Nations Award for the Lighthouse Activities that contribute to fighting climate change with the focus on the urban poor. Vanesa's research focuses on the governance of global environmental change in the urbanization age. She focuses on three interrelated themes. The first one is related to the governance of climate change in urban areas. The second theme focuses on urbanization and the dynamics of energy transition. And the third theme looks at barriers to the implementation of climate action. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our speaker. Vanesa, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's an absolute honor to be here. Although I am a bit intimidated by the qualification of, what did you say, world-class urbanism. Yeah, perhaps that's a little bit too grand for me. But thank you very much. I really appreciate the words. And basically, what I would like to talk today, so I was this provocation that you've made about the manifesto for the Just City. I thought that perhaps then my manifesto is about rethinking the current thinking on climate change and cities, taking a stock. So I've done a presentation which is more general than I normally would do. Normally I would like to present a research project, but I tried today to kind of get a synthesis of work and get a more kind of bird's eye view on my own work. And all my work, particularly in recent years, sorry, I'm not sure why it's not going through. There's an animation there, sorry. So all my work, all over my career, my work has been developed under the rubric of cities and climate change. But more recently, is focused in this idea of climate urbanism, about looking into how the need to respond to climate change is also changing cities and fundamentally our ideas of cities. And also I would invite you to look at that recent... Hello? Excuse me? Okay, sorry, somebody was talking, some voice was in. So this idea of climate urbanism, which we have, with some colleagues, we have worked on, and there's an edited collection called Climate Urbanism with Palgrave, is really looking into how the need to respond to climate change is changing our cities and our ideas of cities. I think I've already repeated that. So this is an enormously important topic. Not only because climate change is a challenge that impacts everywhere and everyone, but also because the responses to climate change are generally deemed insufficient, and the cities are seen as like this new ground, this new hope that we can create new opportunities and new access. But I would say that we should moderate and think about the contradictions embedded in climate urbanism. And this slide that you have there is about the different acceptions of climate urbanism and how climate urbanism has constituted a kind of a point of view which enables a critique of what climate action in the city means. So for me, looking into the future and the manifesto idea, any new thinking on climate urbanism should aim to emphasize all the new issues that are not yet foregrounded in any policy imaginations. The extent of challenges that we are grappling with and that is becoming more present now. So for example, we now understand a bit better that climate change impacts are cascading and interlocking and a lot more complicated than we imagined them to be a decade ago. And also thinking about our need to adapt our thinking about climate change to a world that is also changing simultaneously in different ways. And that there's like a co-production of climate change and other types of global change. In particular, the last report of the IPCC has emphasized the complex relationship between climate change and urbanization, and you are going to hear me to make a lot of emphasis on that point. And when we think about the relationship between climate change and urbanization, we are also thinking about the challenge of urban inequality, which actually has got a lot worse after the COVID-19 pandemic, which some people argue has created a new generation of urban poor. Also, the changing political context of resource security. And finally, this idea, this kind of promise of climate resilient development pathways. So all these ideas that are emerging, which should really examine critically, and I think that's what climate urbanism should do. There is also the need to map the solution space and focusing on responses at different levels. So local interventions, neighborhood and built environment design, citywide planning, and regional and national policies. But when we think about the wide range of responses that we can give to climate urbanism, we have to think about appropriateness and responsibility, and who has different forms of responsibility, and what kind of different capacities and kind of different opportunities for action we could have. So today, I was in a meeting in which there was a lot of emphasis on behavior change. So you could perhaps argue about whether that's the most appropriate response in the context of a problem that has very strong structural drivers as climate change. So in my opinion, to move current thinking forward, I want to just put down the table a few points that I think we must take for granted. So these are things that I am not willing to continue discussing, because I think they're discussed enough and there's like a sort of consensus. So I think we have to move forward. So first, climate change is an existential threat for which urgent action is needed. And this has been emphasized in every policy report. So I'm not so willing anymore to talk with climate deniers to convince anybody about this, because I think we have to move beyond. So there is not such a thing as climate denial, certainly no one that can be sustained logically. I mean, you may find it funny to hear me say that, but only 2 weeks ago, I had to spend 1 hour with a journalist trying to convince them that climate change was something tangible and real. So these are conversations I'm not willing to entertain anymore. And the other conversation I want to move beyond is that obviously cities and urban areas are sites for climate action. So I don't think there's a need to respond to that anymore. I mean, empirical evidence has already shown it. But the question is not whether there are areas of climate action or not, but what are the complications and contradictions that emerge when you implement climate action in cities and urban areas? And it's not a question of looking at the contrast between urban and rural. I mean, they're interlocked. They cannot be looked at it separately. So we have to think how they relate to each other, not to say, oh, this side excludes the other. So I think these are discussions that I find a bit sterile, and I would like to move forward those. And the other divide that I would like to overcome, so these are things that I think our manifesto doesn't need to consider too much. So the other thing is this divide between climate change mitigation and adaptation. I think it's very unhelpful. It actually is conducive of unhelpful delineation of climate responses without considering trade-offs and synergies between both areas. So a very important point of the IPCC report is this idea of maladaptation. The idea that you can take action today to respond to climate change, which actually makes the problems worse in the long term. So I think, for example, when we think about policies of densification to reduce carbon emissions, that create additional vulnerabilities to heat waves, for example. So synergies and trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation are particularly prominent in the urban environment. And I don't think you can look at climate change action in the urban environment without looking at both in tandem. For example, mitigation strategies to facilitate in building, as I was saying, densification or compact cities need to consider how they magnify the impacts of health, the health impacts of climate, of heat waves, as I already explained. So these few points, I think we have to move forward. And then what is next? What is that the things that we should consider in our manifesto? So I have 5 propositions, and so I'm going to read these 5 propositions, and then we can go and discuss them a little bit in detail one by one. So my first proposition is urbanization and climate change are twin challenges and must be addressed in tandem. So what I was saying before, you have to think about climate change, but you have to think about change more broadly, and the kind of complex interactions, not this slicing so much of problems, but looking at things in an integrated manner. My second proposition is there is a need to address urban inequality because it compounds and magnifies the impacts of climate change. My third proposition is that perceptions of living in an increasingly insecure world should not stop decisive climate action. In fact, I would say they are an argument for climate action. My fourth proposition is that thinking outside the box may help to map a broader solution space. And finally, my final proposition is that justice, both justice and limits, are central to delivering climate resilient development pathways in urban areas. And I really like this idea in a recent, I don't know if you've seen a recent special issue in the journal Environment and Urbanization, which is on pathways for urban equality. Not necessarily climate urbanism, but full of relevant knowledge about climate urbanism. So in this special issue, they talk about pathways as strategies to facilitate the governance of possibilities. So when you think about pathways, you are thinking about not foreclosing possibilities that could have a lot of potential, not to create a lock-in of carbon emissions of high carbon infrastructures, for example, or not to create additional vulnerabilities over the long term. So I really like that idea. And I see that I talk about the propositions and I cannot stop myself from trying to explain them. So let's now go into more detail. So all the photographs that you're going to see now are by me. I just took them in a recent trip to the Philippines, where I've been working with the Philippines Alliance, which is the alliance that supports the work of the Homeless People's Federation of the Philippines, and with whom I've been trying to work on thinking about how to support urban resilience in the long term. So the pictures illustrate what I'm going to say. As I say, it's a little bit more generic manifesto style thinking, but if I have the opportunity, I will also explain some examples across the photographs. So let me go first with this idea that urbanization and climate change are twin challenges and must be addressed in tandem. This photo, by the way, is in Valenzuela City, and it's an area which is very prone to flooding and where people are facing different issues of displacement related to the construction of infrastructure in the city. So you see the relationship very close in this example. But apart from empirical examples, this is a key insight from the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, that there is this complex relationship between urbanization and climate change. So on the one hand, as you know, the IPCC is divided in 3 groups. So the report of the working group, of the first working group 1, which focuses on the physical basis of climate change, explains that the empirical evidence of the impact of urbanization on global carbon emissions is actually mixed. So we cannot confirm that actually urbanization is a driver of carbon emissions, although there is evidence that it can be in some cases. But this insight partly reflects the realization that urbanization is not really a single phenomenon, but rather is a diverse set of spatial transformations. There are many ways in which urbanization happens, and it has mixed environmental impacts. But what the work group 1 emphasized is that urbanization compounds the impacts of climate change. So for example, the compounded impact of heat waves and air pollution in cities. The pollution exacerbates the health impacts of heat waves. So, sorry, I've gone ahead of myself. At the same time, the report of working group 2, which is the group that works on adaptation and impacts and vulnerability, emphasizes that urbanization compounds the impacts of climate change. For example, an average increase in temperatures exacerbates the urban heat island effect. That's a very clear impact, and increases the morbidity due to heat in urban areas. At the same time, urbanization concentrates populations and assets. And there is considerably preoccupation about the potential impact of climate change on cities. And this has been particularly highlighted for coastal cities. Finally, the infrastructure and market requirements of urbanization mean that the impacts of climate change in urban areas may have cascading effects across different infrastructure systems, causing wider regional or even national impacts. And again, confirming that you cannot just look at cities in isolation or urban areas in isolation, but you have to look at them in terms of their interrelations in the regions, but also broader across broader distances on space. And finally, and perhaps this is the insight on urbanization from working group 3, urbanization opens up opportunities to transform society in ways that could impact current carbon emissions. For example, the report of the Working Group 3 for the first time has put emphasis on demand management measures as a way to reduce carbon emissions. So urbanization is a process that may entail changes in lifestyles and is a moment of change which could be taken advantage of to facilitate those transformations. So working to harness the opportunities of urbanization is a strategy to address the global challenges of climate change, and also, I would say, biodiversity loss by imagining a sustainable future for cities that we can make possible today. So my second proposition is that there is a need to address urban inequality, particularly for many reasons, but in this case, in the case of climate urbanism, because it compounds and magnifies the impacts of climate change. So again, the sixth assessment report of the IPCC also highlights how inequality exacerbates climate change impacts, as the impacts of climate change affect different social groups in different ways. In particular, marginalized, low-income people are likely to suffer disproportionately from the impacts of climate change. And so, for example, in the photo, you have a settlement, an informal settlement in the city of Davao in the Philippines. And I don't know if you can distinguish very well, there's a barrier there. And what happens is like the barrier was constructed to protect the settlement from the ocean. But actually the water comes in with all the waste from the city of Davao. And when the water filters away, it leaves all the waste behind. So you can see how not only the impacts of climate change affect marginalized populations the worst, but also solutions proposed and developed without the knowledge of local people and without their understanding and without planning, without a process of planning may lead to these kind of solutions that don't help a lot, to be honest, or actually they damage a lot. So in cities and settlements, marginalized groups often occupy the areas which are most exposed to climate impacts, such as coastal areas or areas prone to flooding. So it's not uncommon in the Philippines, for example, it's very clear that many of these informal settlements are exposed to flooding, more than to flooding, to the direct impacts of the typhoons. Moreover, poorer sectors of the population may suffer more from the impacts because the structures where they live may be more, less protected from the impacts of climate change. For example, in a typhoon, middle-class neighborhoods may withstand the impacts of the storm and from the temporal flooding that happens much better than those in low-income neighborhoods with poor quality housing. And then after the storm, poorer populations will have limited resources and capacities to bounce back from disasters. So if you rely on a daily wage, for example, and you have to go to the market to get your wage, you will not have a lot of funds or savings saved in the bank for hairy times. And you won't have an insurance like a middle-class family may have. Sometimes a typhoon may be enough to destroy whatever it is that sustains your livelihood. For example, if you go to fish every day. And finally, vulnerable groups may have restricted access to the actual structures of decision-making that could perhaps make decisions to address their situation, as was in the case of the building of this dike. So if you do not have a voice in the policy process, it's likely that the resulting policies will not acknowledge the needs and constraints that you face in your everyday life. For example, when zoning policies worsen the conditions for populations already exposed to climate impacts. So this, I say that I would like to keep the presentation free from jargon, but I think it's important to highlight this as a question of epistemic injustice, which epistemic injustices are those related to the production of knowledge and to the fact that some people's knowledge is valued different than others. And in particular, for many people, they face a deficit of credibility when exposing their opinions to public policy forums. And this is really what we are saying in the case of people living in informal settlements whose credibility is constantly challenged, even their knowledge about their own experiences. Also, urbanization when we think about the relationship between urbanization and climate change, we have to remember that urbanization also increases inequality. Urbanization tends to reduce poverty and creates market opportunities to develop local and place-based economies. But these impacts occur at the expense of higher inequality rates in urban society, which further entrench extreme poverty, reinforce poverty traps, and creates new mechanisms of social exclusion. And this has all been exacerbated during the pandemic. So for that reason, I think recent years have seen debates on climate justice really take a lot of energy, and also move not just to think about climate justice at the global level, but also thinking about what impact is having at the local level. We could think of climate justice as a movement that as a global movement that started claiming the colonial imperial roots of climate change. This has been also recognized in the IPCC, and that was highlighting the fundamental and just distribution of climate impacts, and this famous argument that those who have polluted the least are the ones who have suffered the worst impacts of climate change. But I think more recently, the climate justice debates has extended to think about the local impacts of the transition to renewables and other challenges related to planning and to the different impacts of climate action on urban environments. So climate urbanism has made climate urbanism scholars have made a big, strong emphasis on the differential impacts of climate action in urban environments. So I think there are two particular themes. I think I'm going very long, no, in my talk, no, because we are already like kind of half. How long do I have still? Because I still have 3 propositions to talk.
I think you still have like 10 to 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, good.
Have a lot of time.
I thought it was already 30 minutes.
No.
So within the theme of inequality, there are 2 particular themes that should be explored further. So I think the first one is how existing patterns of urbanization create differential patterns of vulnerability to climate change. This is actually something that we are doing with the Philippines Alliance, trying to understand how different inequalities are created and relate to different vulnerabilities to climate change. And there is a need to characterize the multiple factors that shape those vulnerabilities. On the one hand, there's a need to understand how diversity, I would say also community diversity, shapes heterogeneous patterns of vulnerability within communities. There are some, for example, differences of gender, sexuality, gender non-conformity, having a disability, ethnic origin or race, education and professions. Those are all things that are shaping how people face climate change. And second, there is a need to understand the spatial constitution of inequalities and how they sediment in, for example, in infrastructure and built environment patterns, but also perhaps on institutions and many inherited processes which we can attribute, for example, in the case of Philippines, to colonization and different processes of imperial domination. And finally, there is the need to understand how existing governance practices reproduce those inequalities, the exclusion of marginalized groups, depending on different identity characteristics, but also depending on their spatial relations and the relationships with infrastructure and housing. This, I would say, is the key of understanding differential patterns of vulnerability to climate change in urban environment. And then, if we think about climate urbanism again, it's not just the differential patterns of vulnerability, but it's also how climate action, I think I'm insisting in this point, how climate action reproduces inequalities and exacerbates them. And this is particularly true when action does not consider the social and economic needs of the most vulnerable communities. I think one very good example, and there's now a kind of body of evidence looking at the impacts of climate urbanism and describing many of the processes that we are seeing as processes of climate gentrification that takes place when actions to securitize the environment, to protect it from climate impacts or to reduce carbon emissions, because sometimes also making an area greener also creates some process of green gentrification. what the result of that is impacts. It has an impact on the land prices in the city, and as land prices go up, it ends up displacing the poorer populations who cannot further afford living in those improved areas. And we are seeing this in the Philippines in many areas where the land prices are going up and people are finding themselves displaced from the places where they've been living for very long and perhaps creating a community. Or even if they have not been living long, that's where they have their livelihood and their community and so on. So I would say those two different aspects are crucial for our future research on this question of inequality and urban inequality. My third, and I just have 3 left, my third proposition is that perceptions of living in an increasingly insecure world should not stop decisive climate action. And this is really something that I haven't researched myself, but I'm seeing increasingly reflected. We're talking about urban inequality, you heard that, all that. And yes. The next thing we have to talk is about that perceptions of living in an increasingly insecure world should not stop decisive climate action. I think we were there. So obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been linked to the need for controlling resources. And almost it's like sometimes it feels like the last stand in a career to move away from fossil fuels, and also like the extent to which the sovereignty of countries like Russia is being challenged by the energy transition and the shift to renewables. Both wind and solar energy have become widely available and cheaper. And some of you may have seen last week the last report of the International Energy Agency, really providing really good news in terms of how rapidly we are adopting renewables, although not fast enough, but certainly very a lot of problems yet to achieve net zero, of course, but this transition is not without problems. And if you remember when we launched the working group 2 of the 6th assessment report, which was in February, the team of the IPCC was forced to make an intervention to address the complex relationship between conflict and climate change, because it took place on the week, just on the Monday after the weekend in which Russia invaded Ukraine. So in that context, we got given this guidance to explain that actually the evidence between conflict and climate change is kind of mixed. And there is evidence that relates climate change to internal conflicts within nations, but the evidence of climate change impacts related to international conflicts is more complex and more difficult to assess. So I think what we are looking at is a very complex relationship between the broader issue of conflict and climate change. And particularly how the existence of the conflict is challenging our capacity to respond to climate change. There's this pressure on existing resources, for example. There is also the conflict reminding us of the fragility of critical infrastructure. And above all, I think the conflict in Ukraine has kind of made more visible the forced movements of people that are happening across different countries. And for me, they have shown what the question of conflict in the context of climate change says, most of all, is the need for collective solidarities to deal with the increasing crisis across the world. And this is climate change, and this is war, and this is the different, whether they are interrelated or not. So I think migration is increasingly a cause of concern in climate change debates, but also we shouldn't forget that migration is also a climate change adaptation strategy, and that some people migrate, whether it's temporarily or permanently, because they cannot live in the places where they are. So I think that perhaps starting developing a welcoming, generous, and convivial stance towards migrants, I mean, changing these terrible discourses that we are hearing across politics, certainly in Europe, but also in other countries, is one of the first strategies that we can do to think about our future with climate change. But in general, I would like to emphasize that when we think about this insecure world, for me, it increases the need for answering to climate change. It's not an excuse not to act. And my fourth proposition is that thinking outside the box may help map a broader solution space. So the starting point for climate action, as you know, are the national plans, which specify the responses to climate change, the NDCs. They are called the NDCs in the COP, in the Conference of Parties jargon. The NDCs contain a mix of sectoral and integrated strategies, and the structure budgets and priorities in national policies, and therefore influence regional and local policies. But as we know, these NDCs efforts are really very much short of what is needed. And at the moment, the COP27, which is taking place in Egypt, is called the COP of implementation, because there is a real preoccupation that even with relatively modest ambitions of carbon reductions, still they are not being achieved. And when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about doubling the budget for adaptation. And in a context in which the commitments for climate finance that were made in 2009 have not been met, these kind of wishes become even more unrealistic. But I think it's possible. I think it's possible. And I think at the same time, we have to think out of the box. So when we think about urbanization and climate change and the NDCs and national policies, we have to think about how national urban policies can be aligned with the NDCs, and perhaps making a stronger effort to create that alignment. And perhaps also bringing inequalities and justice as a core part of that alignment. And second, there is of course a range of planning instruments that can deliver climate change action. Planning for net zero, which includes zoning, transport planning, densification, and building regulations. So there are things that work, but they don't always work well. So they need to be carefully tailored to the patterns of urbanization and the needs of urban dwellers. And as I said before at the beginning of the talk, is when we think about urbanization, we are thinking of many things. We are thinking of many ways in which urbanization is happening. Some of them are very suburban forms of urbanization, as different research projects have shown. So I think it's important to consider that diversity. Adaptation planning is also crucial and is also not receiving the attention and the funding that perhaps we would need. And for some of us, we would like the adaptation planning as something that is done by default and perhaps institutionalized in local institutions. In both cases, you may have heard across, in my talk, planning for climate change would require an emphasis on the inclusion of multiple forms of knowledge and the development of inclusive intersectional methods that can bring a range of voices together, particularly those who are disenfranchised because of their social identity or their spatial locations or their social positions. So planning that is based on a recognition of the situated experiences of risk and vulnerability, as well as the differential capacities to respond to climate impacts, is essential to deliver just planning for climate change. So planning, yes, but what planning and how planning? Also, I would like to emphasize the need for urban design, because it provides built environment solutions that both reduce emissions and vulnerabilities. And it's been nice in the last years to see a lot of examples from built environment professionals. And perhaps a very famous one is the 15-minute city, of which Paris has become an example. So yes, national policies, yes, planning, yes, urban design, these are all places which are bringing responses and ideas to address climate change that need to be balanced. But for me, the greatest innovators are the urban residents themselves. I think place-based innovation for climate change is developed by people within their everyday lives. And sometimes even when the innovation is coming from outside, they play a key role to integrate them into their everyday lives. So for example, in those cases, in those photos you are seeing, I've seen citizens in informal settlements in the Philippines developing different forms of urban gardening to create to securitize food. The photo on the right is a program for mangrove restoration in a coastal community in Davao. They also develop different flexible forms of embankment, but not only in Philippines. In India, for example, groups of citizens develop a governance system to protect the ecosystems that cool cities. Social enterprises in Malawi have developed new technologies for drying fruit or for recycling waste and kind of cleaning the waste from the city, maybe not so much for a net zero city, but for a more resilient city. There is a very famous program in Rosario, Argentina, which received the World Resource Institute Prize, Rose Prize for Sustainable Cities in Rosario, Argentina, which is a leading program of urban agriculture that integrates a lot of marginal communities and has recovered the seeds from the indigenous peoples, the Guaranis. So, like all around the world, you are getting examples from citizens which are really exciting. What is happening is that these efforts cannot always be measured, cannot always be put into the indices. You cannot always attribute a figure to say how many emission reductions they have done. Sometimes these are efforts that are broader culture changing efforts and that have a longer term trajectory and development. So that brings me to the last point, which is this idea of pathways. Justice and limits will be central to delivering climate resilient development pathways in urban areas. And this idea of climate resilient development pathways is a key idea from the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. And the idea is that you can create alignment of interests in society and perhaps even support this with a global partnership for climate change. So climate resilient development pathways, and I always have to think how to say this, they are shared course of action across society that put at their core the improvement of the well-being and prosperity of all people, and especially those who are the most vulnerable, while at the same time reducing carbon emissions and reducing the risks for climate change. And generally what the IPCC report argues is that these pathways are within reach, but they required a collective transformation effort. So possibly one thing you could argue that they need is a global partnership to support their delivery at all levels. And of course, many people would argue that climate change action depends on the alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. But perhaps we should also be a little bit critical to the extent to which Agenda 2030 is still fit for purpose in the post-COVID context, and the way in which global agendas of development may be imposed on cities and actually driving inequalities in climate urbanism. So I would say, and these are going to be my last 2 points, that I'm going to highlight these two strategies, which I would say they are really important for climate resilient development pathways, and perhaps they are not so much reliant on this global perspective on the United Nations agenda for sustainable development. So the first one involves working towards a just transition. So this will mean a full transformation of production and consumption. That's what is meant by the just transition. But at the same time, we have to think about justice as something that happens within society as a whole. So initially, the just transition was emphasized in relation to the rights of workers. So you cannot create a change of this magnitude without thinking about how it's going to impact on different working lives. So that can be extended to the whole society, and thinking about when we create a change of that magnitude, what is going to be its implications for different kinds of people, different kinds of populations. And of course, a just transition also relates with thinking about the ecological limits and thinking about perhaps whether growth-based policies continue to be the right way of looking about climate action. And that's true at a more general level. But what does it mean for cities to think about a future city, a sustainable city that is not planning for growth? What would it mean to think about a city that is looking at the environment and the resources, and how is living with those. So how do you heard, for example, I'm sure you have heard Kate Raworth, Dognut economics, and I never can say those words. And so this is something about planetary limits. But how do those ideas of planetary limits influence what we can say about cities? And my last point is about thinking what can make climate resilient development pathways possible. And again, so thinking about the local level help us thinking about the broadening the solution space. But we, of course, cannot live all cannot live all to that local level. I'm sorry, it's like a long day and I'm starting to be a little bit tired. But so I think we have to combine strategic efforts to think structurally about the change, but with efforts to localize climate action and efforts to recognize the different possibilities. And this is something that we've understood through the processes of upgrading and incremental urbanism that have helped some informal settlements. So they have to rely on the understandings and capacities of people living in informal settlements. But of course, these people cannot work alone. They need support to access finance, to access land, and to sometimes perhaps developing nice designs for the houses. So it's those processes of collaboration that can create meaningful transformations. So of course, local governments have played a key role in mediating climate action in urban environments, but we have to remember that local governments shouldn't be left alone, and sometimes they are given a lot of responsibilities that go beyond their capacities. So we have to think how to work with local governments and what other actors could perhaps intervene also in delivering climate action. So those were my 5 principles. I think I want to go, so this is thank you, but I want to go back, if I can, to the slide with the 5 principles. So my little manifesto for climate change and the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Juliana.
Of the share.
Thank you, Vanessa, for this wonderful presentation and for sharing with us your 5 propositions in your manifesto. We already have a question from the audience. Mario, you have your hand raised. Would you like to speak?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Hi.
I'm going to drink a glass of water.
Oh, that's
No worries.
That's the very famous Mario. For people in the room, Mario is very, very famous.
Ah, why?
For the good reasons.
Famous, Mario? Did I know you?
He's a singer.
For
He's
good
a secret
reasons.
singer
Mm.
from Puerto
Hidden
Rico.
talents.
Oh my God,
Yes.
what kind of music do you sing?
Oh my God, everything. Bad Bunny, salsa, merengue, anything you want.
Love it.
So yeah, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It's been very enriching. And many times I was able to draw many relations to what is going on in Puerto Rico currently. So I had a question. Being under a colonial political relationship with the United States, particularly, funds and programs requirements limit the ability to adapt mitigation and infrastructure projects to particular communities and regions. So considering that Puerto Rico's infrastructure is mostly in the coastline, what planning tools under the lens of justice and equity would you recommend to adapt our critical infrastructure in the coast, but don't have the necessary opportunity to adapt those proposals based on our particular necessities?
So you are saying you receive funding from the US, but the funding comes with a lot of conditions?
Correct. The funding comes, most of the times, fundings from the states come with particular requirements that adapt to the realities of the United States, but not necessarily to a tropical island scenario. So many times projects are just done to say, hey, we use the funds, but don't necessarily comply with the real issues that are found here in the island.
I think when you have access to funds like that, and you see it sometimes that you say, oh, we have to access the funding because it's there. And from the perspective of a local government or a small NGO that's working locally and so on and so forth, I think it's important always to have some balance and to assess that sometimes having funds to do something that you don't need to do may be worse than not having the funds. And we need climate finance, but we need climate finance to appropriate things. It is very difficult because I think there are two fundamental debates on climate finance. I mean, other people will have other opinions, but in my opinion, from the local government perspective and from the place-based action perspective, there are two things. I think the first one is whether we have grants or loans. And for example, so I'm going to give you an example also from the Philippines, and unfortunately I didn't put a picture, but this very poor community in Davao, around a decade ago, they wanted to do a bridge, and eventually they got a loan to do a bridge, and and it's a beautiful bamboo bridge, and people really love it. So in a way, it has really brought something to the community that they wanted. But at the same time, they thought they would pay it within 3 years, and now 10 years later, they are still paying it. So having a loan may not always be the best solution. And a lot of governments are maybe not willing to give grants, and so a lot of the funding is coming with conditions. So that's one of the debates. But the other debate is that most of the climate finance that we've seen moving in substantial ways, always the efforts have been to move large amounts of finance across. And what that has happened is that it has prioritized very large projects over more place-based projects. And I think sometimes it becomes difficult to understand how you can do effective things suited to the local context to really make a change in place. So what you are saying is maybe cities trying to develop portfolios of action that can be funded collectively, but the examples are few and far between. And some cities have made the efforts to create those portfolios, and they haven't succeeded in getting them funded. Which I think I seem to remember that the city of, I don't want to say an example because maybe I'm wrong, but still we are finding problems to understand how the finance can be disseminated. So working with informal settlement dwellers at the moment, one key way to develop resilience is giving access to land, because a lot of informal communities are being displaced, but land prices are going up very quickly. So that access to land, but these people cannot access, I mean, the amounts to buy those lands are still small in comparison with those big adaptation projects, but they are not being able to access it because of the kind of vagaries of climate finance. So I think that's really a problem, because over the last decades, we've seen that informal settlement dwellers can form saving groups and access funds and pool their funds to actually create the risk investment and enable them to access land. So I think that's something that we have to think carefully, but unfortunately, it's not, I don't think it's making it into the climate change debates. So I hope that answers something about what is happening in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mario.
Before we go on, I just want to note that two of our former speakers are here. So Gina and Clarissa are both here. So I'm thinking maybe we did something right for our former speakers to be here, and I'm sure they want they are here actually to listen to Vanesa. But thanks a lot for being here with us.
Oh.
Go on, Juliana, sorry.
No worries. I was just going to thank Mario for the question and Vanessa for the answer. And then there is another hand raised, Taneas Shakir. Would you like to make your question?
Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, so the question is, thank you so much for the talk, Vanessa. It's quite relevant to my thesis. And so my question is, could you please talk about environment justice in terms of distribution of public bads? Because I work, my topic is related to waste management and how most of the landfills are also situated where people belonging to the most vulnerable sections are. sections of the society are. So could you talk about environmental justice in terms of distribution of public bads?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm not sure if I can give you a very coherent answer to a very challenging question, but perhaps I could speak about it with reference to what was the case of my PhD many years ago. So it was like I was very interested early on the spatial impacts of the coal industry and the fossil fuels industry. And I work in Bosnia to look at how communities who were affected by the deposit of ash, coal ash, were living. And it is a complicated relationship, and it's always been. So we can say, oh, okay, there's the pollution, let's move populations away. But actually, that relationship is a little bit more complex. On the one hand, we know that there are populations that are disproportionately disadvantaged because they regularly get situated near most polluted areas. And this is the insights of environmental racism that honestly we know since the 1980s. So this is something that is systematically happening. And despite the efforts of activists, I don't think it's being addressed. This is emphasized in the context of climate change, because with climate change, this environmental racism is happening at a planetary scale, right? In which certain populations are singled out for who they are as less valued, and their locations, they get exposed to these environmental bads that you're talking about. But at the same time, when people live, for example, near a polluting industry or in an area of risk, they don't always, the relationships with that area may be complex. So you may not want to always move from that area. Maybe that's not what you want. Maybe what you want is to have enough local support and enough policy support to enable you to live in that area, to enable you to have a restorative kind of to have a restorative process in which you and perhaps the polluter and different policy organizations can really improve that area. Because a lot of people, for example, in the communities I studied in Bosnia, they had such strong historical links. I mean, with many people, I sat down to talk about coal ash, and I ended up talking about the partisans in the Second World War. So they have such a strong relationship with that place where they've grown up and where they've lived all their lives, and where they have their relationships, they have their economies, they have their, and perhaps some of them even had jobs in the power plant and had complex relationships. So what I did a lot of research when I was there was some literature which now has gone a bit out of fashion, so it's maybe another argument, but there was some literature that would say, oh, people would would accept environmental risk when they get given a job. So like people would do this rational exchange, and that's not really true. But what is really true is that people live in complex sets of relationships in places, and you don't want to section those relationships. So when I was in Philippines, a lot of communities that see themselves displaced or are under the threat of displaced because of the increasing risk of climate change, the increasing water. Some of them were really happy to move because they saw that as a permanent solution and maybe as a way to access land tenure. But some other communities, perhaps those who already had land tenure in a now risky area, they were not so happy to move, and they would have preferred to stay. So I think these environmental bads, the relationship between communities and environmental bads is complex, and it's actually it's been one of the biggest interests in my academic career. So perhaps that's why I cannot give you such an articulated answer, because I still keep asking myself questions about it. I hope that answers your.
Yeah, I'm also facing a lot of it's quite a gray area, there are no definitive answers. So I'm also reading up. So are there some authors you would suggest, some researchers whose work you would suggest to get better understanding?
Well, I mean, most of the work on climate urbanism, so in climate adaptation, I would say the work of Kasia Paprocki, she just did a book on Bangladesh, and it's a really excellent book. So I would really recommend. But if you want to look at more classical works on environmental racism, and I mean, reading the work of Robert Bullard, the name, I forgot the title of his, he's so famous, I should know. But the Black Environmental Network, which, for example, Julian Ageman was part of. So those are really important works. Also, I really always liked this book from somebody called Edelstein, which was called Contaminated Communities. And it was a book which was on the tradition of social psychology. So it was maybe not as theoretical, not as maybe kind of radical on environmental racism as other books were, but it was really interesting in terms of describing the detail of how people lived with pollution. So I think that work on pollution, and of course in India were really nice works coming around the time with the example of Bhopal. I think some of the best work I've read was from, unfortunately now maybe it's a decade since I read it, but I would recommend that kind of work on environmental racism, contaminated communities, and the different ways. And somehow this research on contaminated land and polluting land, it's kind of gone a bit on the sides, no, in the context of climate change, because climate change has different concerns. But for me, it remains a source of inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
They're very, very important works.
Okay, thank you so much.
In terms of knowledge, also, I'm reminded of Susan Owen's work on knowledge and pollution. That was also very good.
Susanna?
Sue Owens, O-W-E-N. So this is kind of, I'm recommending you all work that maybe you haven't come across. So that's what I'm trying.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Dumping in Dixie is the book. That's very, very good.
Thanks, Vanessa, for the answer and for the recommendations. Some people in the chat mentioned that they didn't call the names. So before, if you could just write down before you leave the names on the chat, that would be amazing. Roberto, you're muted.
Thanks, Clarissa. Clarissa is leaving. Thanks, everyone. Well, we have the opportunity to have Vanessa a few minutes more, I guess. So if there are any other questions. Right now, I cannot see everyone. All right. So maybe we can go forward then with the rest of the workshop. Vanessa, I cannot see you now, but I know you're there. On behalf of the Delft University of Technology and all the partner universities that are organizing this with us, thank you so very much for being here with us today. I thought the talk was incredibly informative and really loved your impatience actually with climate denialism and other nonsense that we see. I think that's and I just wanted to show this book. Oh, I can. It's called Epistemic Injustice by Miranda Fricker. I'm reading it and really adoring the
it's so good.
So I encourage everyone to. So thanks so very much. We are going to continue.
Can I just say one thing?
Of course, go on.
So there is a book that we just made with Linda Westman. It's called Urban Sustainability and Justice. It discusses a lot on environmental paths and discusses the work on environmental racism. It's not so much on climate change, but more on sustainability. But it's open access, so you can download it for free from Bloomsbury. And then I also put there a couple of titles. So Climate Urbanism from Palgrave, and also inclusive urban development on the global south. So both have insights of things I've talked today. But the urban sustainability and justice is the one that is for free. So I hope you can all access.
Solomila, I see that you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
A little, if you don't mind, of course, but I try to be very short.
Go on.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture. It's like good evening from Ukraine, and in this case, I would like to ask you just question about the crisis, climate resilience in crisis context. We know that a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot of bodies that polluted water, a lot of oil pollution. Can you recommend some literature about this? I don't know how to post-war or just like a crisis, climate renewing, or something about environmental rebirth, or in this context. Maybe you know.
Environmental rebirth is a really good sentence.
Yeah, I just.
So do you mean work on environmental restoration after war?
Yeah.
So I unfortunately, from the top of my head, I cannot give you a name now. And I mean, you have to consider it's a bit late in the evening, so my memory is just like a bit like dark.
Just
and
a
it's not
question.
exactly my topic, but I do think some work exists. So I remember when I was working in Bosnia, there was a lot about environmental restoration in the post-war conflict context of Bosnia, although a lot of it tends to be a bit of from policy tanks and policy oriented. So, but what I can do is maybe I have a very good friend called Jan Selby. He's a political scientist, and he's just published. So I can write the name out.
Yeah, thank you, because I didn't recognize it on.
Yeah. So I can ask him, and but he's just published a book on conflicts and climate change. So probably that would be worth looking at. But I can ask him, because your question is very specific. I think it's a very good question, actually, Solomia. I think there's a need for serious work on the post-conflict context of environmental restoration and the potentials of it.
We understand that it's like it won't be the first that we started to do after war climate resilience, but it's a huge problem. It's not just in case our country, but it will influence on all over the world. So I think a lot of country needs this methods, instruments to work with in future.
Well, if I may, you might want to check our course. We are going to give a course next year called Tools for oh my God, Tools for Urban. I'm also tired. Tools for Urban Recovery, specifically designed for Ukraine. So it's for the post-war in Ukraine. And it will also be online. So it will be here at TU Delft, but we will also have a version online, Solomia. So I hope you can participate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would be thankful if you send me additional information about.
Yeah.
I left you another name there, Andrew Baldwin. So unfortunately, I would like to have more names from other countries. They are not coming to my head, but I'll look at them. And
thank you very much.
I'll see what we can look. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Vanessa. That is very, very good.
So now I have to leave, right?
No. You can stay if you want, but we are going to do the remaining of the workshop. Thanks a lot.
Maybe I leave so I go for dinner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But very nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. I hope it's useful, and please do contact me. And also, when you contact me, I'll try to give you more variety of references that sometimes from the top of my head, one may not be able to articulate them. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, bye. Guys, so everyone, we are quite, so of course we are here to listen to Vanesa, so we let her speak, and we are almost at the end of our activity today. So maybe I will share my screen very quickly, and I will ask you 3 questions. Can you see my screen? Main takeaways?
Yes.
If you can go to your phone and go to menti.com and use the code 8510-8162, maybe you guys can help me put the link. I would like to know what are the main takeaways, maybe from the series. It doesn't have to be only from today, but from the series, what is the main takeaway for you? We have, I think, still 160 people in the room, so that would be interesting. And I am going to stop the... Oh, Philip, we missed your question. I'm very sorry. I guess this question was for Vanesa. We can also discuss it. So please let us know what are the main takeaways. Is it working for everyone? Oh, there it comes. Pairing problems. Ah, that's interesting. All cases are different. Well, yes, but I think we have some common drivers of problems. Increasing inequality is a global problem. Climate change is a global problem. War in Ukraine is a global problem. Not only in Ukraine, but mainly in Ukraine for sure. Justice priorities, very good. Justice can solve everything. Maybe, we don't know. Just adaptation, I think that's important. The European Union, as you know, has a Green Deal, which is similar to the United States Build Back Better bill that was not approved. Ours was approved, and it talks about a just transition to sustainability, right? So that's justice is a must. Justice, urgency for action, that's for sure. Equity over equality. Ah, that's a very good one. I hope everybody knows the difference between equity and equality. Participation, collaboration. Thanks for whoever wrote collaboration. As architects, many of us are taught to be very competitive, and I think we need to give much more priority and attention to how collaborative actually architecture needs to be successful, right? Intersectional causes. Thanks a lot for saying that. I hope everybody knows what intersectionality is. Urban policy is important. Environmental justice, discussion, equity. Okay. Yeah, let me see how many people do we have? 147. So we still have quite a lot of people, but I don't see everybody answering. We want to know the main takeaways not only from today, but from the series of 4 lectures we had. So while people enter their answers, let me just remind you, and maybe I will ask Divya and then Mo to put the link, if you still have it, to the online Excel sheet where we have the groups. From today on, we are going to abandon our mailing list that we used so far, and we are going to shift to the mailing list in the groups. So if you are not enrolled in the groups to write a manifesto, you have to do it today. Yeah, thanks a lot. Oops. Oh my God, I shouldn't have done that.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
It's pity, but students from my university still didn't put their names to stable Excel table like for team, and I don't know if they will have an opportunity to do this. It's like a two parts of question. If they didn't join us, can I write something as you write it previously, like for teacher, and write like 100 words?
Yeah, 1,000 words.
1,000, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So for the teachers who have joined us, we have invited them to deliver a text of 1,000 words max. And of course, the students can still enroll, right? It's not like I'm going to close the Excel sheet, so they can enroll in the next few days, but it's important that we have all the names and all the emails, because otherwise we cannot organize the book. So it's important also to have your correct name and the name that you want to appear on the book. Otherwise, we will make mistakes and you are going to be quite unhappy. So please make sure you have the right name, the right email, and the right university to which you belong, so we can correctly attribute. Perfect. We have a lot of super interesting answers here, and a lot of them have to be with justice. A lot of them have to be with I see here the importance to understand, context related, localized, not to impose the design. Whoever wrote that, you are very, very right. We have the idea that our designs are going to solve everything, but maybe we don't know exactly what needs to be designed yet. What is a benefit for, I think that comes from the lecture from Hiba, that where she claimed that war is a money-making machine, right? And I think she is probably right. Justice as a process. Maybe, does anyone want to say something about the main takeaways so that I'm not talking all the time? Does anybody want to say something? Otherwise, we go forward. I think you can still answer, but we are going. What are the main opportunities for action in your reality, in your city, and in your country? Maybe, Solomila, we could say that in Ukraine, the main opportunity for action is peace and then reconstruction, right? Probably. But maybe others can add, what are the main opportunities for action in their realities? I know the question is not easy. Oh, but look at this. Wonderful answer.
Truly, during the last period, I'm just found in love in people of all over the world and of Ukrainians, because it's like you feel this gathering, you feel this support, and I don't know, I didn't feel this through the previous my 30 years. So it is the first time I feel this.
Yeah, that's
it's very pity that the situation is horrible, but the feeling of community all over the world is incredible.
Absolutely. I think everybody is very convinced about the injustice of this war, right? It's a war that came from nothing. It's completely pointless.
But I believe that like we will be the last, and after our finishing, we win this war, we help to other countries to stop their wars, because it's very good to spend all these potentials, all these monies on all these resources for something big, something good, but not for weapon and so on.
Yeah, so much money, right, is being spent. All right, guys, there are lots togetherness. I really love that. Ride your bike. Whoever wrote that, you're totally right. The polluter pays. Polluter, the main culprits of climate change must pay, right? Community action, political status, community participation, local governments, collaboration, regulation, cooperation, visibility, that's very good. Systematic resilience, so the resilience of systems, civil society, community engagement. Oh, I think you really understood my question, guys. It's really amazing. Does anybody want to say something? Yeah, in one of the previous sessions, I asked who the heroes of people were, and and many people said Elon Musk. So I'm reading Mariana's answer to Philip, and I'm thinking about how absolutely unethical sometimes Elon Musk can be. So you might have want to look into that. After school activities. Wow. Okay. Ground up actions, improve your city. Very good. Thanks a lot. I think people really understood the question. Policy. All right. We are getting very close to the end. So before we go to the next slide, if we have time, I really would like to know if anybody has any questions about how to write and deliver the manifesto. I think you have been receiving my emails, and in the emails, it's always attached the booklet where we explain a little bit how to write a manifesto and how to submit it. But I still have quite a few questions about group formation. So if you have any questions, please let us know. Thanks, Divya. Are there any questions? Don't be afraid. All right. So we covered quite a lot of topics, and if you look at our YouTube channel, you will see the sessions from previous manifestos. This is the 3rd edition, and you will see that the series of manifestos for the Just City has covered a lot of ground. We have had really top people discussing issues of justice in the city. But of course, we can't cover everything, but we would like to know, we would like to know, what would you like to know about? Mira Mahmoud is asking me if we can preview the draft before submitting. It's a little bit difficult for us to give feedback before the submission, but we will give feedback after the submission, and you can always resubmit after our feedback. So it's not, it's not a test. We are going to help people and give feedback. So it's a little bit difficult to give it now, though. Okay, so topics people would like to discuss. Technological determinism, that's really interesting. Oh, Russell, you have a question.
Yeah, and I don't want to jump into what you were just getting ready to, but to go back to the process for a second, can I say one thing that I think maybe it might help definitely, I think some of my students, but others on the call?
Absolutely, go ahead.
So I think in terms of the process, that spreadsheet, and I looked at it in terms of all the groups, people have done a great job. What you're saying is that by putting your name attached to other people in one of those group numbers, you as a team are supplying this group with a manifesto that you have come up with on your own. So if you're a team of four, the four of you have contributed information about what a city, an issue, something going on that you would like to have published in the Just City Manifesto edition number 3. Is that correct? Am I correct in saying it that way?
You are absolutely correct. I think it's very useful to think of this as a collective endeavor, right? And we are not going to give you any grades, so it's really interesting if you really put your names there and you work together. So yes.
And
yeah,
the guide, yeah, no, so and the guidelines that are in the chat will guide you through, you know, how creative you can be and how long it needs to be. And, you know, in the past, we've talked about original artwork or photos, or, you know, to make this as lively as can be, not just text. And remind me of the deadline that you have imposed.
Yeah, we are saying, I think it's the 1st of January, 2023. So you really have more than 1 month. Yeah, 2 months actually,
Okay.
almost.
And what I wanted, yeah, sorry.
Go on.
What I was going to say is that I know for myself and the students that have entered that are associated with me, and maybe this is true for others on the call, that my deadline is not January 1st, that they must submit it earlier than that. So I that's one thing that I wanted to just get out there as well, to make sure everybody is on the same wavelength in terms of the Just City Manifesto deadline of January 1st, 2023, which is a fine deadline to have. And then if you are participating as part of a class or a project or something, there might be other deadlines that you need to speak to your instructor, professor, teacher, whoever about. So I just wanted to mention those couple things. I hope I didn't add to the confusion, but cleared things up. Thanks.
No, I think you're clearing things up and things that I forgot to mention. Indeed, we have a number, I think we have more than 20 teachers who joined this activity as a class activity. And of course, they have their own deadlines, right? I know that Faranak Miraftab at the University of Illinois, she really has another deadline. It's much earlier. And I see that Christina has also another deadline. So that's our deadline for the book. And then we can oh, 30th January, is it? Oh, sorry, Bruno. Maybe I'm oh, Tari is saying that their deadline is this week. Bruno, maybe you're right. Please look at the booklet. It's in January. That's all I know. And we are happy to discuss this. But let's go back to the topics you would like to discuss. I see Global South coming very strongly. Of course, we want and need to discuss, and there is a new terminology for the Global South. Maybe you're not aware. It's now called the majority world, which I think is very, very interesting. So we are definitely going to give a lot of attention to the Global South. Urban farming is coming quite strongly. The right to the city, equity, mobility, injustice. Urban installations, that's interesting. Open source architecture, commonplace diversity, migration, solutions to displacement. All right, this is a good list of things we can consider. Guys, we are 5 minutes over time. Are there any final questions or considerations? Russ, if you remember something, you're better remembering the organizational stuff than I am.
I will just say I appreciate all the work for those that put this on. I know I always enjoy it, and I know it's a huge undertaking considering the time changes and zones, and just keeping people in terms of organized of where to go and what time. And it's nice being on the Monday. I guess that simplifies things, but yeah, it's I think the best thing that the people on the call, if you have questions, I'm more than happy. You can reach out to me. You can. I know the rest of the team that is that has all the backgrounds behind them are the official. But I'll put my name out there as someone who you can reach out to, has been participated in the past, to try to answer questions and take some of the burden off you, since you guys have done so great. And I appreciated all our speakers. Everybody really added to it. And I think this, at the end of the day, not just to give kudos, is this is a very unique undertaking that I have enjoyed being part of and seeing grow. And I hope we continue it on into the future, because it is something that brings us together from so many different places and spaces. So thanks to everybody that participates.
Thank you so much. Very well said. It's about this global conversation, right? Yes, and I would like to thank everyone who participated also in the organization. And I have to say, Russell and Christina, and now Bruno is joining us, and people from South Africa and from Asia, especially because in Asia it's quite late for them and they are still participating. For people from Africa who we want to attract even more. We don't attract a lot of people from Africa to this. But I'm super grateful, especially to Caroline as well, who is, and now also to Juliana, who is joining us. So thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you. Let me stop sharing.
And
All right.
Thanks to you, Roberto, for always taking the lead and leading these sessions, really, always.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm looking forward to reading the manifestos. As Russ correctly pointed out, you have to invent new ways also of making your ideas known. It doesn't have to be only text. It could be more things. We don't know exactly what, but it should go on the book, right? So it needs to be somehow printable. But I'm really happy with the outcome of this edition. We have more than 130 groups enrolled. So if everybody delivers a manifesto, we'll have the biggest book ever. That's will be unprintable, but that's fine. The more the merrier. Guys, thank you so very much. Enjoy your evening, enjoy your day wherever you are. And from TU Delft and from the Netherlands, we tell you goodbye for now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.